The combat in Final Fantasy XIV kinda sucks right now. The fights are actually really good. They're new, interesting, and more complex than ever. But despite that, I still find myself getting bored. Why? Hello Void, it's me, Eldon. And today I want to try and find out why the combat in 14 has gotten so boring. If you find the topic interesting or have thoughts of your own, like and subscribe. If not for me, do it for the orphans. So combat. Anecdotally, it's not great. People find themselves dissatisfied with the way 14 is right now. But why is that? For me, I've certainly noticed that it's not holding my attention the way it used to. Maybe it's burnout, but considering how many people are feeling the same, I can't help but worry it's something more. My best guess is the problem is balance. It's too balanced. No, I don't think 14 should be unbalanced, that's crazy. But the slavish devotion to balance 14 has is leading to a ton of negative externalities that are reverberating through the rest of the game. To put it bluntly, the game's too samey. Everything feels the same. Job homogenization, the simplification of mechanics, the 2-minute meta, it all creates an environment that feels stagnant. Even the best thing grows tiresome after repeated exposure. Even combat this top-notch, if it's been the same for way too long, creates a problem. But why is it the same? There's been expansions, new jobs, new actions, but everything feels the same. 14 has a very peculiar kind of combat. We have these long, very balanced, dance-like fights without any sort of health gating and lacking largely in traditional puzzle mechanics. Instead, we have these DPS checks where efficiency is key, and to design fights in that manner requires each job have a very specific set of skills. Everyone needs to meet very specific requirements, and to meet those requirements, jobs tend to be designed in the same way. Every healer has to do a certain amount of healing, every tank a certain amount of mitigation. DPS need not only perform a certain amount of damage per second, but also have buffs located at the proper times for when everything works in harmony. And that means all jobs end up functioning the exact same way, having the same rhythm, the same thought process behind them. But that reality is not inevitable, not required. It only exists because the game has put too much of its budget towards balance. If you want to know what I mean, we need to look at a fundamental model of understanding combat in games. This model is not definitive nor fully encapsulating, but it is one way to look at things. In any game, you have a budget that you can spend between 3 pillars of combat. These are complexity, novelty, and balance. The more you put into one, the less you have to spend on the others. A balance has to be struck between all 3 of these pillars. Wherever you end up in that balance determines how your game functions, and putting too much into any one can lead your game to feeling lopsided. If I were to make an estimation as an observer, I would say 14 falls here in the graph, with a lot towards balance and a lot drained from both complexity and novelty as a result. Let's look at all 3 of these pillars and how they reflect in 14 and the problems their current state causes. Complexity is difficulty. How hard is each fight? How much does it ask of you? Both in mechanical skill, but also in reaction time and mental processing. 14 is not necessarily a difficult game, and recently they've put a ton into their fight design, creating more complex encounters that push people to the limits. But at the same time, they've sapped a lot of the complexity from jobs to balance it out. Sadly, this has done perhaps more harm than good. The lack of complexity in jobs doesn't just mean it's easier to focus on mechanics, it changes the fundamental thought process behind the game. You're not thinking about how you, as a specific job, should react in a situation. Instead, you're just reacting to the mechanics. With a competent raid leader, you can essentially divest all thought from yourself. An easy example of this mechanic is positionals. As a monk before, you used to have to balance completing mechanics successfully with the risk of moving out of position to get your positionals. Now, I don't think positionals are a perfect implementation of this. They're kind of primitive, and there are certainly more interesting ways to do this. But the point still stands. With less complex jobs, you end up with less interesting thought processes, less fun, and a bunch of new fights that end up feeling boring just after they come out. Novelty is newness. How many new and new feeling experiences does the game contain? The essential problem with novelty in many games is that content is always more expensive to produce than it is to play. It takes a large team weeks to make a dungeon, but I can finish that in like 20 minutes. So how do we make the game feel more replayable? There is certainly something to be said about incentive structures, about creating rewards at the end of a grind. But realistically, the game itself has to be fun over multiple runs. And the way you do that is by having multiple sub-experiences for every piece of content. With one job, every dungeon is a single experience. But if you have 20 unique jobs to play with, then all of a sudden a dungeon is fresh 20 different times. It's a force multiplier that applies across every piece of content in the game. But only if jobs feel unique. And sadly, as we've already established, every job feels kinda the same right now. They all must do the same things in order for the current design philosophy to work. If we need every range to have an AoE damage reduction on a 90-second cooldown, then every ranged does, and at every point in the fight where you're playing a ranged, you have to press the button. Instead of 20 jobs, we have like 5. And why is that? Well, as we've established, it's balance. Balance is equality. The equality in options and effectiveness between different jobs. In 14, balance is a primary goal. Creating jobs that can all complete fights requires all jobs to have certain abilities, and balancing between those abilities, making sure they all function equally, if not in the same way, is one of the primary goals the game has. All the tanks can mitigate the same amount and deal about the same amount of damage. This is true across all roles, but with balance comes sameness. The easiest way to balance across so many different options is to make all of the options effectively the same. This is implemented in 14 through measures like kit similarities, as well as timing changes, and the 2-minute meta. Job homogenization as a whole is a result of this phenomenon. Now, I can't say this enough, I don't think 14 should be unbalanced. When I was getting into the game, one of the primary attractors for a lot of people was the game is balanced, that every job can be used to clear every fight. But at some point, that stopped being a boon and became a curse, something imposed on the game. The way we look at every single piece of imbalance and file it away, we end up scraping off every interesting thing about it, every loose edge, every inconsistency. They took chitin, guys! They took chitin because of the fucking crits! When the end goal is to create a perfectly balanced experience, you end up reducing complexity and novelty, and that creates a stale ecosystem. This desire for balance also disincentivizes the devs from changing anything, from evolving. The current combat system, which is really good for balance, has stayed around far too long. We need significant shakeups in the way 14's combat is designed and implemented, so that we can get truly novel experiences, so the game feels new and fresh. But because changing things drastically would compromise the current state of balance and also pose the risk of people not liking it, we can't change, or at least they refuse to. And that's why we end up with the problems of today. But what to do? I've identified the problems, but haven't presented any solutions. The best thing we can do is simply talk about it. Not complain or go after the devs, that's fucking crazy. Instead, we need to have an open, honest discussion and express our discontent with the current state of affairs. This will incentivize the devs to go out and make changes. Regardless of what the changes are, that's what we want. 14 is certainly overproduced, so I don't know how far we'll actually be able to get, but we can always try. But since I feel incomplete not presenting solutions of my own, I'm gonna give a couple of shots, okay? Now, it's important to remember all of this is speculation, but let's try and fix some of the issues, shall we? Let's make some jobs more interesting. We need to reckon with the core issue of 14, that every job needs to perform its role requirements, but also feel new. Now, in the past, this was done by creating a niche for every job. Black Mage stood still, Dark Knight used mana. This was fine, but as more jobs get introduced, it becomes harder to find niches for all of them. And also, they don't really feel very fulfilling in the long run. There's only so many ways to skin an onion. So I'm proposing that instead we simplify job requirements to a smaller subsection of the job, leaving room on the hotbar for more interesting and out there abilities. Reduce the buttons of healing on a healer to only like 60% instead of 90%, creating room for cool damage rotations, and maybe some unique subsystems? At the same time, we can remove the requirements for certain things like the 2-minute meta, giving each job its own timings and feel. Let them line up and fall out of sync as they will. If people want to optimize it, let them learn to optimize it. That's fine. I think a really fun thing to add would be some sort of optional job actions. Maybe we give Warrior something that lets them deal more damage the more Vuln stacks they have. Maybe we give Picto a 20-second portrait that they can spend time painting. These things should not be optimal. I actually encourage them to be suboptimal. But if they're fun and optional, let them have it. To balance this, we could also expand role actions. Maybe bring back something like switch skills, but in an entirely different way, where you can bring over skills or role abilities from other roles to complement your own. Maybe I want my summoner to have a low cooldown melee OGCD so it plays quicker, but I have to position myself closer. Maybe give my samurai a 2-minute defensive cooldown so I don't die to a tank buster just because I'm pumping and the tanks died. I don't know. Again, there's literally a billion things you can do to fix these options, and I'm just spitballing because I think it's fun. At the end of the day, what really needs to happen is that 14 needs to move away with its obsession with balance. Create reasonable but loose standards for the amount of variance allowed in jobs. Maybe even publish them so that we can stick by them and so the community doesn't complain whenever things change. If we move away from this rigidity and open ourselves up to change, then something better can happen. Even if the combat right now is theoretically good, it's been the same for far too long, and that makes people dissatisfied with the game. We just need to have change occur, and hopefully that will help. And if it doesn't, we can just change it again. It's a long road, and it will always be such. But as long as we start walking now, we can make it to tomorrow. But that's enough out of me. I've been Eldon. Thank you so much for watching. Take it easy.